The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, Disc 3.
Chapter 139. I like Sherlock Holmes, but I do not like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who was the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories. That is because he wasn't like Sherlock Holmes, and he believed in the supernatural. And when he got old, he joined the Spiritualist Society, which meant that he believed you could communicate with the dead. This was because his son died of influenza during the First World War, and he still wanted to talk to him. And in 1917, something famous happened called the Case of the Cottingley Fairies. Two cousins called Francis Griffiths, who was 9 years old, and Elsie Wright, who was 16 years old, said they used to play with fairies by a stream called Cottingley Beck, and they used Francis's father's camera to take 5 photographs of the fairies. But they weren't real fairies. They were drawings on pieces of paper that they cut out and stood up with pins because Elsie was a really good artist. Harold Snelling, who was an expert in fake photography, said, "These dancing figures are not made of paper nor any fabric. They are not painted on a photographic background. But what gets me most is that all these figures have moved during the exposure." But he was being stupid, because paper would move during an exposure, and the exposure was very long, because in the photograph you can see a little waterfall in the background, and it's blurred. Then Sir Arthur Conan Doyle heard about the pictures, and he said he believed they were real in an article in a magazine called The Strand. But he was being stupid too, because if you look at the pictures, you can see that the fairies look just like fairies in old books, and they have wings and dresses and tights and shoes, which is like aliens landing on Earth and being like Daleks from Doctor Who, or Imperial Stormtroopers from the Death Star in Star Wars, or little green men like in cartoons of aliens. And in 1981, a man called Joe Cooper interviewed Elsie Wright and Francis Griffiths for an article in a magazine called The Unexplained. And Elsie Wright said all 5 photographs had been faked, and Francis Griffiths said that 4 had been faked but 1 was real. And they said Elsie had drawn the fairies from a book called Princess Mary's Gift Book by Arthur Shepperson. And this shows that sometimes people want to be stupid, and they do not want to know the truth. And it shows that something called Occam's razor is true. And Occam's razor is not a razor that men shave with, but a law. And it says, "Entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitatem," which is Latin, and it means, no more things should be presumed to exist than are absolutely necessary. Which means that a murder victim is usually killed by someone known to them, and fairies are made out of paper, and you can't talk to someone who is dead. Chapter 149. When I went to school on Monday, Siobhan asked me why I had a bruise on the side of my face. I said that Father was angry, and he had grabbed me, so I had hit him, and then we had a fight. Siobhan asked whether Father had hit me, and I said I didn't know because I got very cross, and it made my memory go strange. And then she asked if Father had hit me because he was angry, and I said he didn't hit me, he grabbed me, but he was angry. And Siobhan asked if he grabbed me hard, and I said that he had grabbed me hard. And Siobhan asked if I was frightened about going home, and I said I wasn't. And then she asked me if I wanted to talk about it any more, and I said that I didn't. And then she said, "Okay." And we didn't talk about it anymore, because grabbing is okay if it's on your arm or your shoulder when you're angry, but you can't grab someone's hair or their face. But hitting is not allowed, except if you're already in a fight with someone, then it's not so bad. When I got home from school, Father was still at work, so I went into the kitchen and I took the key out of the little china jug shaped like a nun and opened the back door and went outside and looked inside the dustbin to find my book. I wanted to get my book back because I liked writing it. I liked having a project to do, and I liked it especially if it was a difficult project, like a book. Also, I still didn't know who had killed Wellington, and my book was where I had kept all the clues that I had discovered, and I did not want them to be thrown away. But my book wasn't in the dustbin. I put the lid back on the dustbin and walked down the garden to have a look in the bin where Father keeps the garden waste, such as lawn clippings and apples that have fallen off the trees, but my book wasn't in there either. I wondered if Father had put it into his van and driven to the tip and put it into one of the big bins there, but I didn't want that to be true, because then I would never see it again. One other possibility was that Father had hidden my book somewhere in the house. So I decided to do some detecting and see if I could find it. Except that I had to keep listening really hard all the time, so I would hear his van when he pulled up outside the house, so he wouldn't catch me being a detective. I started by looking in the kitchen. My book was approximately 25 centimetres by 35 centimetres by 1 centimetre, so it couldn't be hidden in a very small place, which meant that I didn't have to look in any really small places. I looked on top of the cupboards and down the back of the drawers and under the oven, and I used my special Maglite torch and a piece of mirror from the utility room to help me see into the dark spaces at the back of the cupboards where the mice used to get in from the garden and have their babies. Then I detected in the utility room. Then I detected in the dining room. Then I detected in the living room, where I found the missing wheel from my Airfix Messerschmitt BF109 G6 model under the sofa. Then I thought I heard Father coming through the front door, and I jumped, and I tried to stand up fast, and I banged my knee on the corner of the coffee table, and it hurt a lot, but it was only one of the drug people next door dropping something on the floor. Then I went upstairs, but I didn't do any detecting in my own room, because I reasoned that Father wouldn't hide something from me in my own room unless he was being very clever and doing what's called a double bluff, like in a real murder mystery novel. So I decided to look in my own room only if I couldn't find the book anywhere else. I detected in the bathroom, but the only place to look was in the airing cupboard, and there was nothing in there. Which meant that the only room left to detect in was Father's bedroom. I didn't know whether I should look in there, because he had told me not to mess with anything in his room. But if he was going to hide something from me, the best place to hide it would be in his room. So I told myself I would not mess with things in his room. I would move them, and then I would move them back. And he would never know I'd done it, so he wouldn't be angry. I started by looking under the bed. There were 7 shoes, and a comb with lots of hair in it, and a piece of copper pipe, and a chocolate biscuit, and a porn magazine called Fiesta, and a dead bee, and a Homer Simpson pattern tie, and a wooden spoon. But not my book. Then I looked in the drawers on either side of the dressing table, but these only contained aspirin and nail clippers and batteries and dental floss, and a tampon and tissues, and a spare false tooth, in case Father lost the false tooth he had to fill the gap where he knocked a tooth out when he fell off the ladder putting a bird box up in the garden, but my book wasn't in there either. Then I looked in his clothes cupboard. This was full of clothes on hangers. There was also a little shelf at the top that I could see onto if I stood on the bed, but I had to take my shoes off in case I left a dirty footprint that would be a clue if Father decided to do some detecting. But the only things on the shelf were more porn magazines and a broken sandwich toaster and 12-wire coat hangers and an old hairdryer that used to belong to Mother. In the bottom of the cupboard was a large plastic toolbox, which was full of tools for doing do-it-yourself, like a drill and a paintbrush and some screws and a hammer. But I could see these without opening the box, because it was made of transparent grey plastic. Then I saw that there was another box underneath the toolbox, so I lifted the toolbox out of the cupboard. The other box was an old cardboard box that's called a shirt box because people used to buy shirts in them. And when I opened the shirt box, I saw my book was inside. Then I didn't know what to do. I was happy because Father hadn't thrown my book away, if I took the book, he would know I had been messing with things in his room, and he'd be very angry, and I had promised not to mess with things in his room. Then I heard his van pulling up outside the house, and I knew that I had to think fast and be clever. So I decided that I would leave the book where it was, because I reasoned that Father wasn't going to throw it away if he had put it into the shirt box, and I could carry on writing in another book that I would keep really secret, and then, maybe later, he might change his mind and let me have the first book back again, and I could copy the new book into it. And if he never gave it back to me, I would be able to remember most of what I had written, so I would put it all into the second secret book, and if there were bits I wanted to check to make sure I had remembered them correctly, I could come into his room when he was out and check. Then I heard Father shutting the door of the van. And that was when I saw the envelope. It was an envelope addressed to me, and it was lying under my book in the shirt box with some other envelopes. I picked it up. It had never been opened. It said, Christopher Boone, 36 Randolph Street, Swindon, Wiltshire. Then I noticed that there were lots of other envelopes, and they were all addressed to me. And this was interesting and confusing. And then I noticed how the words Christopher and Swindon were written. They were written with little circles instead of dots over the letter I. I only know 3 people who do little circles instead of dots over the letter I, and one of them is Siobhan, and one of them was Mr. Loxley, who used to teach at the school, and one of them was Mother. And then I heard Father opening the front door, so I took one envelope from under the book, and I put the lid back on the shirt box, and I put the toolbox back on top of it, and I closed the cupboard door really carefully. And Father called out, Christopher! I said nothing, because he might be able to hear where I was calling from. I stood up and walked round the bed to the door, holding the envelope, trying to make as little noise as possible. Father was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and I thought he might see me, but he was flicking through the post which had come that morning, so his head was pointing downwards. Then he walked away from the foot of the stairs towards the kitchen, and I closed the door of his room very quietly and went into my own room. I wanted to look at the envelope, but I didn't want to make Father angry, so I hid the envelope underneath my mattress. Then I walked downstairs and said hello to Father. And he said, So, what have you been up to today, young man? And I said, Today we did life skills with Mrs. Gray, which was using money and public transport, and I had tomato soup for lunch and 3 apples. And I practiced some maths in the afternoon, and we went for a walk in the park with Mrs. Peters and collected leaves for making collages. And Father said, Excellent, excellent. What do you fancy for chow tonight? Chow is food. I said I wanted baked beans and broccoli, and Father said, I think that can be very easily arranged. Then I sat on the sofa, and I read some more of the book I was reading called Chaos by James Glick. Then I went into the kitchen and had my baked beans and broccoli, while Father had sausages and eggs and fried bread and a mug of tea. Then Father said, I'm going to put those shelves up in the living room, if that's all right with you. I'll make a bit of a racket, I'm afraid, so if you want to watch television, we're going to have to shift it upstairs. And I said, I'll go and be on my own in my room. And he said, Good man. And I said, Thank you for supper, because that is being polite. And he said, No problem, kiddo. And I went up to my room. And when I was in my room, I shut the door, and I took out the envelope from underneath my mattress. I held the letter up to the light to see if I could detect what was inside the envelope, but the paper of the envelope was too thick. I wondered whether I should open the envelope, because it was something I had taken from Father's room. But then I reasoned that it was addressed to me, so it belonged to me, so it was okay to open it. So I opened the envelope. Inside there was a letter, and this is what was written in the letter. 451 Chapter Road, Willesden, London, NW25NG, 0208-887-8907. Dear Christopher, I'm sorry it's been such a very long time since I wrote my last letter to you. I've been very busy. I've got a new job working as a secretary for a factory that makes things out of steel. You'd like it a lot. The factory is full of huge machines that make the steel and cut it and bend it into whatever shapes they need. This week they're making a roof for a cafe in a shopping centre in Birmingham. It's shaped like a huge flower and they're going to stretch canvas over it to make it look like an enormous tent. Also, we've moved into the new flat at last, as you can see from the address. It's not as nice as the old one, and I don't like Willesden very much, but it's easier for Roger to get to work, and he's bought it. He only rented the other one, so we can get our own furniture and paint the walls the colour we want to. And that's why it's been such a long time since I wrote my last letter to you, because it's been hard work packing up all our things and then unpacking them and then getting used to this new job. I'm very tired now, and I must go to sleep, and I want to put this into the letterbox tomorrow morning, so I'll sign off now and write you another letter soon. You haven't written to me yet, so I know that you're probably still angry with me. I'm sorry, Christopher, but I still love you. I hope you don't stay angry with me forever, and I'd love it if you were able to write me a letter, but remember to send it to the new address. I think about you all the time. Lots of love, your Mum. Then I was really confused, because Mother had never worked as a secretary for a firm that made things out of steel. Mother had worked as a secretary for a big garage in the centre of town. And Mother had never lived in London. Mother had always lived with us. And Mother had never written a letter to me before. There was no date on the letter, so I couldn't work out when Mother had written the letter, and I wondered whether someone else had written the letter and pretended to be Mother. And then I looked at the front of the envelope, and I saw that there was a postmark, and there was a date on the postmark, and it was quite difficult to read, but it said London, 16/10/97, which meant that the letter was posted on 16th October 1997, which was 18 months after Mother had died. And then the door of my bedroom opened, and Father said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm reading a letter." And he said, "I've finished the drilling. That David Attenborough nature program's on telly if you're interested." I said, "Okay." Then he went downstairs again. I looked at the letter and thought really hard. It was a mystery, and I couldn't work it out. Perhaps the letter was in the wrong envelope, and it had been written before Mother had died. But why was she writing from London? The longest she had been away was a week when she went to visit her cousin Ruth, who had cancer, but Ruth lived in Manchester. And then I thought that perhaps it wasn't a letter from Mother. Perhaps it was a letter to another person called Christopher from that Christopher's mother. I was excited. When I started writing my book, there was only one mystery I had to solve. Now there were two. I decided that I wouldn't think about it any more that night, because I didn't have enough information, and you could easily leap to the wrong conclusions, like Mr. Athelney Jones of Scotland Yard, which is a dangerous thing to do, because you should make sure you have all the available clues before you start deducing things. That way you're much less likely to make a mistake. I decided that I would wait until Father was out of the house. Then I would go into the cupboard in his bedroom and look at the other letters and see who they were from and what they said. I folded the letter and hid it under my mattress in case Father found it and got cross. Then I went downstairs and watched the television. Chapter 151. Lots of things are mysteries, but that doesn't mean there isn't an answer to them. It's just that scientists haven't found the answer yet. For example, some people believe in the ghosts of people who have come back from the dead. And Uncle Terry said that he saw a ghost in a shoe shop in a shopping centre in Northampton because he was going down into the basement when he saw someone dressed in grey walk across the bottom of the stairs. But when he got to the bottom of the stairs, the basement was empty and there were no doors. When he told the lady on the till upstairs, they said it was called Tuck, and he was a ghost of a Franciscan friar who used to live in the monastery which was on the same site hundreds of years ago, which was why the shopping centre was called Grey Friars Shopping Centre, and they were used to him and not frightened at all. Eventually, scientists will discover something that explains ghosts, just like they discovered electricity, which explained lightning. And it might be something about people's brains, or something about the Earth's magnetic field, or it might be some new force altogether. And then ghosts won't be mysteries. They'll be like electricity and rainbows and non-stick frying pans. But sometimes a mystery isn't a mystery. And this is an example of a mystery which isn't a mystery. We have a pond at the school with frogs in, which are there so we can learn how to treat animals with kindness and respect, because some of the children at school are horrible to animals and think it's funny to crush worms or throw stones at cats. And some years there are lots of frogs in the pond, and some years there are very few. And if you drew a graph of how many frogs there were in the pond, the line would ricochet up and down quite irregularly. And if you looked at the graph, you might think that there was a really cold winter in 1987 and 1988 and 1989 and 1997, or that there was a heron which came and ate lots of the frogs. Sometimes there is a heron who comes and tries to eat the frogs, but there's chicken wire over the pond to stop it. But sometimes it's nothing to do with cold winters or cats or herons. Sometimes it's just maths. There is an actual formula for a population of animals, which is n new equals lambda times the set of n old times the set of 1 minus n old, where n stands for the population density. It was discovered by Robert May and George Oster and Jim York. It can tell you something about when populations will grow or go extinct. And ultimately, it means that sometimes things are so complicated that it's impossible to predict what they're going to do next, but they're only obeying really simple rules. And it means that sometimes a whole population of frogs or worms or people can die for no reason whatsoever, just because that's the way the numbers work. Chapter 157. It was 6 days before I could go back into Father's room to look in the shirt box in the cupboard. On the first day, which was a Wednesday, Joseph Fleming took his trousers off and went to the toilet all over the floor in the changing room and started to eat it, but Mr. Davis stopped him. Joseph eats everything. He once ate one of the little blocks of blue disinfectant which hang inside the toilets, and he once ate a £50 note from his mother's wallet, and he eats string and rubber bands and tissues and writing paper and paints and plastic forks. Also, he bangs his chin and screams a lot. Tyrone said that there was a horse and a pig in the poo, so I said he was being stupid, but Siobhan said he wasn't. They were small plastic animals from the library that the staff used to make people tell stories, and Joseph had eaten them. So I said I wasn't going to go into the toilets because there was poo on the floor, and it made me uncomfortable to think about it, even though Mr. Ennison had come in and cleaned it up. And I wet my trousers, and I had to put on some spare ones from the spare clothes locker in Mrs. Gascoigne's room. So Siobhan said I could use the staff room toilets for 2 days, but only 2 days, and then I'd have to use the children's toilets again. And we made this a deal. On the second, third, and fourth days, which were Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, nothing interesting happened. On the fifth day, which was a Sunday, it rained very hard. I like it when it rains hard. It sounds like white noise everywhere, which is like silence, but not empty. I went upstairs and sat in my room and watched the water falling in the street. It was falling so hard that it looked like white sparks, and this is a simile too, not a metaphor. And there was no one around because everyone was staying indoors. And it made me think how all the water in the world was connected. And this water had evaporated from the ocean somewhere, in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico or Baffin Bay, and now it was falling in front of the house, and it would drain away into the gutters and flow to a sewage station where it would be cleaned, and then it would go into a river and go back into the ocean again. And in the evening on Monday, Father got a phone call from a lady whose cellar had flooded, and he had to go out and fix it in an emergency. If there's only one emergency, Rodri goes and fixes it, because his wife and children went to live in Somerset, which means he doesn't have anything to do in the evenings apart from playing snooker and drinking and watching the television. And he needs to do overtime to earn money to send to his wife to help her look after the children. And Father has me to look after. But this evening there were 2 emergencies, so Father told me to behave and to ring him on his mobile phone if there was a problem, and then he went out in the van. So I went into his bedroom and opened up the cupboard and lifted the toolbox off the top of the shirt box and opened the shirt box. I counted the letters. There were 43 of them. They were all addressed to me in the same handwriting. I took one out and opened it. Inside was this letter. 3rd May, 451C Chapter Road, London, NW2 5NG, 0208 887 8907. Dear Christopher, we have a new fridge and cooker at last. Roger and I drove to the tip at the weekend to throw the old ones away. It's where people throw everything away. There are huge bins for 3 different colours of bottles and cardboard and engine oil and garden waste and household waste and larger items. That's where we put the old fridge and cooker. Then we went to a second-hand shop and bought a new cooker and a new fridge. Now the house feels a little bit more like home. I was looking through some old photos last night, which made me sad. Then I found a photo of you playing with the train set we bought for you a couple of Christmases ago, and that made me happy because it was one of the really good times we had together. Do you remember how you played with it all day, and you refused to go to bed at night because you were still playing with it? And do you remember how we told you about train timetables? And you made a train timetable, and you had a clock, and you made the trains run on time. And there was a little wooden station too, and we showed you how the people who wanted to go on the train went to the station and bought a ticket and then got on the train. And then we got out a map, and we showed you the little lines which were the train lines connecting all the stations. And you played with it for weeks and weeks and weeks, and we bought you more trains, and you knew where they were all going. I liked remembering that a lot. I have to go now. It's 3:30 in the afternoon. I know you always like to know exactly what time it is. And I have to go to the co-op and buy some ham to make Roger's tea with. I'll put this letter in the post box on the way to the shop. Love, your Mum. Then I opened another envelope. This was the letter that was inside. Flat 1, 312 Lausanne Road, London, N8 5BV, 0208 756 4321. Dear Christopher, I said that I wanted to explain to you why I went away when I had the time to do it properly. Now I have lots of time, so I'm sitting on the sofa here with this letter and the radio on, and I'm going to try and explain. I was not a very good mother, Christopher. Maybe if things had been different, maybe if you'd been different, I might have been better at it. But that's just the way things turned out. I'm not like your father. Your father's a much more patient person. He just gets on with things, and if things upset him, he doesn't let it show. But that's not the way I am, and there's nothing I can do to change that. Do you remember once when we were shopping in town together? And we went into Bentols, and it was really crowded, and we had to get a Christmas present for Grandma. And you were frightened because of all the people in the shop. It was the middle of Christmas shopping when everyone was in town. And I was talking to Mr. Land, who works on the kitchen floor and went to school with me. And you crouched down on the floor and put your hands over your ears, and you were in the way of everyone. So I got cross, because I don't like shopping at Christmas either, and I told you to behave, and I tried to pick you up and move you. But you shouted, and you knocked those mixers off the shelf, and there was a big crash, and everyone turned round to see what was going on. And Mr. Land was really nice about it, but there were boxes and bits of broken bowl on the floor, and everyone was staring. And I saw that you'd wet yourself, and I was so cross, and I wanted to take you out of the shop, but you wouldn't let me touch you. And you just lay on the floor and screamed and banged your hands and feet on the floor. And the manager came and asked what the problem was. And I was at the end of my tether, and I had to pay for 2 broken mixers, and we just had to wait until you stopped screaming. And I had to walk you all the way home, which took hours because I knew you wouldn't go on the bus again. And I remember that night I just cried and cried and cried, and your father was really nice about it at first, and he made you supper and he put you to bed, and he said these things happen and it will be okay. But I said I couldn't take it anymore. And eventually he got really cross and he told me I was being stupid and said I should pull myself together, and I hit him, which was wrong, but I was so upset. We had a lot of arguments like that, because I often thought I couldn't take it anymore. And your father's really patient, but I'm not. I get cross, even though I don't mean to. And by the end, we stopped talking to each other very much, because we knew it would always end up in an argument and it would go nowhere. And I felt really lonely. And that was when I started spending lots of time with Roger. I mean, obviously, we'd always spent lots of time with Roger and Eileen, but I started seeing Roger on his own because I could talk to him. He was the only person I could really talk to. And when I was with him, I didn't feel lonely anymore. And I know you might not understand any of this, but I wanted to try to explain so that you knew. And even if you don't understand now, you can keep this letter and read it later, and maybe you might understand then. And Roger told me that he and Eileen weren't in love with one another anymore, that they hadn't been in love with one another for a long time, which meant that he was feeling lonely too, so we had a lot in common. And then we realized that we were in love with one another. And he suggested that I should leave your father and that we should move into a house together. But I said that I couldn't leave you, and he was sad about that, but he understood that you were really important to me. And then you and me had that argument. Do you remember? It was about your supper one evening. I'd cooked you something, and you wouldn't eat it, and you hadn't eaten for days and days, and you were looking so thin. And you started to shout, and I got cross and threw the food across the room, which I know I shouldn't have done. And you grabbed the chopping board, and you threw it, and it hit my foot and broke my toes. Then, of course, we had to go to the hospital, and I had that plaster put on my foot. And afterwards, at home, your father and I had a huge argument. He blamed me for getting cross with you, and he said I should just give you what you wanted, even if it was just a plate of lettuce or a strawberry milkshake. And I said I was just trying to get you to eat something healthy. And he said you couldn't help it. And I said, well, I couldn't help it either, and I just lost my rag. And he said that if he could keep his temper, then I should bloody well keep my temper. And it went on and on like this. And I couldn't walk properly for a month. Do you remember? And your father had to look after you. And I remember looking at the two of you and seeing you together and thinking how you were really different with him, much calmer. And you didn't shout at one another. And it made me so sad, because it was like you really didn't need me at all. And somehow, that was even worse than you and me arguing all the time, because it was like I was invisible. And I think that was when I realized you and your father were probably better off if I wasn't living in the house. Then he'd only have one person to look after instead of 2. Then Roger said that he'd asked the bank for a transfer. That means he asked them if he could have a job in London, and he was leaving. He asked me if I wanted to come with him. I thought about it for a long time, Christopher. Honestly, I did. And it broke my heart, but eventually I decided it would be better for all of us if I went. So I said yes. I meant to say goodbye. I was going to come back and pick up some clothes when you were back from school. And that was when I was going to explain what I was doing and say that I would come back and see you as often as I could, and you could come down to London sometimes to stay with us. But when I rang your father, he said I couldn't come back. He was really angry. He said I couldn't talk to you. I didn't know what to do. He said that I was being selfish and that I was never to set foot inside the house again, so I haven't. But I have written you these letters instead. I wonder if you can understand any of this. I know it'll be very difficult for you, but I hope you can understand a little. Christopher, I never meant to hurt you. I thought that what I was doing was the best for all of us. I hope it is. And I want you to know that this is not your fault. I used to have dreams that everything would get better. Do you remember you used to say that you wanted to be an astronaut? Well, I used to have dreams that you were an astronaut, and you were on the television, and I thought, that's my son. I wonder what it is that you want to be now. Has it changed? Are you still doing maths? I hope you are. Please, Christopher, write to me sometime, or ring me on the telephone. The number's at the top of the letter. Love and kisses. Your mother. Then I opened a third envelope. This was the letter that was inside. 18th September, Flat 1, 312 Lausanne Road, London, N8, 0208 756 4321. Dear Christopher, well, I said I'd write you every week, and I have. In fact, this is the second letter this week, so I'm doing even better than I said. I have a job. I'm working in Camden at Perkin and Rashid, which is a chartered surveyors. That means they go around looking at houses and work out how much they should cost and what work needs to be done on them and how much that work will cost. And also, they work out how much new houses and offices and factories will cost to build. It's a nice office. The other secretary is Angie. Her desk is covered in little teddy bears and furry toys and pictures of her children, so I've put a picture of you in a frame on my desk. She's really nice, and we always go out for lunch together. I don't know how long I'll stay here, though. I have to do a lot of adding up of numbers for when we send bills out to clients, and I'm not very good at doing this. You'd be better at it than I am. The company is run by two men called Mr. Perkin and Mr. Rashid. Mr. Rashid is from Pakistan and very stern and always wants us to work faster. And Mr. Perkin is weird. Angie calls him Pervy Perkin. When he comes and stands next to me to ask a question, he always puts his hand on my shoulder and squats down so his face is really near mine and I can smell his toothpaste, which gives me the creeps. And the pay is not very good either, so I shall be looking for something better as soon as I get the chance. I went up to Alexandra Palace the other day. It's a big park just round the corner from our flat, and the park is a huge hill with a big conference centre on the top, and it made me think of you, because if you came here, we could go there and fly kites or watch the planes coming into Heathrow Airport, and I know you'd like that. I have to go now, Christopher. I'm writing this in my lunch hour. Angie's off sick with the flu, so we can't have lunch together. Please write to me sometime and tell me about how you are and what you're doing at school. I hope you got the present I sent you. Have you solved it yet? Roger and I saw it in a shop in Camden Market, and I know you've always liked puzzles. Roger tried to get the two pieces apart before we wrapped it up, but he couldn't do it. He said that if you managed to do it, you were a genius. Loads and loads of love. Your mother. And this was the fourth letter. 23rd August, Flat 1, 312 Lausanne Road, London, N8. Dear Christopher, I'm sorry I didn't write last week. I had to go to the dentist and have 2 of my molars out. You might not remember when we had to take you to the dentist. You wouldn't let anyone put their hand inside your mouth, so we had to put you to sleep so that the dentist could take one of your teeth out. Well, they didn't put me to sleep. They just gave me what is called a local anesthetic, which means that you can't feel anything in your mouth, which is just as well because they had to saw through the bone to get the tooth out. And it didn't hurt at all. In fact, I was laughing because the dentist had to tug and pull and strain so much, and it seemed really funny to me. But when I got home, the pain started to come back, and I had to lie on a sofa for 2 days and take lots of painkillers. Then I stopped reading the letter because I felt sick. Mother had not had a heart attack. Mother had not died. Mother had been alive all the time. And Father had lied about this. I tried really hard to think if there was any other explanation, but I couldn't think of one. And then I couldn't think of anything at all because my brain wasn't working properly. I felt giddy. It was like the room was swinging from side to side, as if it was at the top of a really tall building and the building was swinging backwards and forwards in a strong wind. This is a simile too. But I knew that the room couldn't be swinging backwards and forwards, so it must have been something which was happening inside my head. I rolled onto the bed and curled up in a ball. My stomach hurt. I don't know what happened then, because there's a gap in my memory, like a bit of the tape had been erased. But I know that a lot of time must have passed, because later on, when I opened my eyes again, I could see that it was dark outside the window. And I'd been sick, because there was sick all over the bed and on my hands and arms and face. But before this, I heard Father coming into the house and calling out my name, which is another reason why I know a lot of time had passed. And it was strange, because he was calling, "Christopher? Christopher?" and I could see my name written out as he was saying it. Often I can see what someone is saying written out, like it's being printed on a computer screen, especially if they're in another room. But this wasn't on a computer screen. I could see it written really large, like it was on a big advert on the side of a bus. And it was in my mother's handwriting, with little circles over the letter I. And then I heard Father come up the stairs and walk into the room. He said, "Christopher, what the hell are you doing?" And I could tell that he was in the room, but his voice sounded tiny and far away, like people's voices sometimes do when I'm groaning and I don't want them to be near me. And he said, "What the fuck are you—" "That's my cupboard, Christopher. Those are—" Oh, shit. Shit. Then he said nothing for a while. Then he put his hand on my shoulder and moved me onto my side, and he said, "Oh, Christ." But it didn't hurt when he touched me, like it normally does. I could see him touching me, like I was watching a film of what was happening in the room, but I could hardly feel his hand at all. It was just like the wind blowing against me. And then he was silent again for a while. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Christopher. I'm so sorry." And then I noticed again that I had been sick because I could feel something wet all over me, and I could smell it, like when someone's sick at school. Then he said, "You read the letters." Then I could hear that he was crying, because his breath sounded all bubbly and wet, like it does when someone has a cold and they have lots of snot in their nose. Then he said, "I did it for your good, Christopher. Honestly, I did. I never meant to lie. I just thought it was better if you didn't know that I didn't mean to. I was going to show them to you when you were older." Then he was silent again. Then he said, "It was an accident." Then he was silent again. Then he said, "I didn't know what to say. I was in such a mess." She left a note and then she rang, and I said she was in hospital because I didn't know how to explain. It was so complicated, so difficult. And I said she was in hospital. And I know it wasn't true, but once I'd said that, I couldn't change it. Do you understand? Christopher? Christopher? It got out of control, and I wish... Then he was silent for a really long time. Then he touched me on the shoulder again and said, "Christopher, we have to get you cleaned up, okay?" He shook my shoulder a little bit, but I didn't move. And he said, "Christopher, I'm going to go to the bathroom and I'm going to run you a hot bath. Then I'm going to come back and take you to the bathroom, okay? Then I can put the sheets into the washing machine." Then I heard him get up and go to the bathroom and turn the taps on. I listened to the water running into the bath. He didn't come back for a while. Then he came back and touched my shoulder again and said, "Let's do this really gently, Christopher. Let's sit you up and get your clothes off and get you into the bath, okay? I'm going to have to touch you, but it's going to be all right." Then he lifted me up and made me sit on the side of the bed. He took my jumper and my shirt off and put them on the bed. Then he made me stand up and walk through to the bathroom. And I didn't scream, and I didn't fight, and I didn't hit him. Chapter 163. When I was little and I first went to school, my main teacher was called Julie, because Siobhan hadn't started working at the school then. She only started working at the school when I was 12. And one day, Julie sat down at a desk next to me and put a tube of Smarties on the desk, and she said, "Christopher, what do you think is in here?" And I said, "Smarties." Then she took the top off the Smarties tube and turned it upside down, and a little red pencil came out, and she laughed, and I said, "It's not Smarties, it's a pencil." Then she put the little red pencil back inside the Smarties tube and put the top back on. Then she said, "If your mummy came in now and we asked her what was inside the Smarties tube, what do you think she would say?" Because I used to call Mother Mummy then, not Mother. And I said, "A pencil." That was because when I was little, I didn't understand about other people having minds. And Julie said to Mother and Father that I would always find this very difficult. But I don't find this difficult now, because I decided that it was a kind of puzzle, and if something is a puzzle, there's always a way of solving it. It's like computers. People think computers are different from people because they don't have minds, even though in the Turing test, computers can have conversations with people about the weather and wine and what Italy is like, and they can even tell jokes. But the mind is just a complicated machine. And when we look at things, we think we're just looking out of our eyes, like we're looking out of little windows and there's a person inside our head. But we're not. We're looking at a screen inside our heads, like a computer screen. And you can tell this because of an experiment which I saw on a TV series called How the Mind Works. And in this experiment, you put your head in a clamp and you look at a page of writing on a screen. And it looks like a normal page of writing and nothing is changing. But after a while, as your eye moves round the page, you realize that something is very strange, because when you try to read a bit of the page you've read before, it's different. And this is because when your eye flicks from one point to another, you don't see anything at all and you're blind. And the flicks are called saccades. Because if you saw everything when your eye flicked from one point to another, you'd feel giddy. And in the experiment, there's a sensor which tells when your eye is flicking from one place to another, and when it's doing this, it changes some of the words on the page in a place where you're not looking. But you don't notice that you're blind during saccades because your brain fills in the screen in your head to make it seem like you're looking out of two little windows in your head. And you don't notice that words have changed on another part of the page because your mind fills in a picture of things you're not looking at that moment. And people are different from animals because they can have pictures on the screens in their heads of things which they are not looking at. They can have pictures of someone in another room, or they can have a picture of what's going to happen tomorrow, or they can have pictures of themselves as an astronaut, or they can have pictures of really big numbers, Or they can have pictures of chains of reasoning when they're trying to work something out. And that is why a dog can go to the vet and have a really big operation and have metal pins sticking out of its leg, but if it sees a cat, it forgets that it has pins sticking out of its leg and chases after the cat. But when a person has an operation, it has a picture in its head of the hurt carrying on for months and months. And it has a picture of all the stitches in its leg and the broken bone and the pins. And even if it sees a bus it has to catch, it doesn't run, because it has a picture in its head of the bones crunching together and the stitches breaking and even more pain. And that's why people think that computers don't have minds, and why people think that their brains are special and different from computers. Because people can see the screen inside their head, and they think there's someone in their head sitting there looking at the screen, like Captain Jean-Luc Picard in Star Trek: The Next Generation, sitting in his captain's seat looking at a big screen. And they think that this person is their special human mind, which is called a homunculus, which means little man. And they think that computers don't have this homunculus. But this homunculus is just another picture on the screen in their heads. And when the homunculus is on the screen in their heads, because the person is thinking about the homunculus, there's another bit of the brain watching the screen. And when the person thinks about this part of the brain, the bit that's watching the homunculus on the screen, they put this bit of the brain on the screen. And there's another bit of the brain watching the screen. But the brain doesn't see this happen, because it's like the eye flicking from one place to another, and people are blind inside their heads when they do the changing from thinking about one thing to thinking about another. And this is why people's brains are like computers. And it's not because they're special, but because they have to keep turning off for fractions of a second while the screen changes. And because there's something they can't see, people think it has to be special. Because people always think there's something special about what they can't see, like the dark side of the moon, or the other side of a black hole, or in the dark when they wake up at night and they're scared. Also, people think they're not computers because they have feelings and computers don't have feelings. But feelings are just having a picture on the screen in your head of what is going to happen tomorrow or next year, or what might have happened instead of what did happen. And if it's a happy picture, they smile. And if it's a sad picture, they cry. Chapter 167. After Father had given me a bath and cleaned the sick off me and dried me off with a towel, he took me to my bedroom and put some clean clothes on me. Then he said, "Have you had anything to eat yet this evening?" But I didn't say anything. Then he said, "Can I get you anything to eat, Christopher?" But I still didn't say anything. So he said, "Okay, look, I'm going to go and put your clothes and the bed sheets into the washing machine, and then I'll come back, okay?" I sat on the bed and looked at my knees. So Father went out of the room and picked up my clothes from the bathroom floor and put them on the landing. Then he went and got the sheets from his bed and brought them out onto the landing together with my shirt and my jumper. Then he picked them all up and took them downstairs. Then I heard him start the washing machine, and I heard the boiler starting up and the water in the pipes going into the washing machine. That was all I could hear for a long time. I doubled twos in my head because it made me feel calmer. I got to 33,554,432, which is 2 to the 25th power, which was not very much because I've gotten to 2 to the 45th power before, but my brain wasn't working very well. Then Father came back into the room again and said, "How are you feeling? Can I get you anything?" I didn't say anything. I carried on looking at my knees. And Father didn't say anything either. He just sat down on the bed next to me and put his elbows on his knees and looked down at the carpet between his legs, where there was a little red piece of Lego with 8 knobbles on. Then I heard Toby waking up because he's nocturnal, and I heard him rustling in his cage. And Father was silent for a really long time. Then he said, "Look, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I want you to know that you can trust me. And Okay, maybe I don't tell the truth all the time. God knows I try. Christopher, God knows I do, but life is difficult, you know? It's bloody hard telling the truth all the time. Sometimes it's impossible. And I want you to know that I'm trying, I really am. And perhaps this is not a very good time to say this, and I know you're not going to like it, but you have to know that I'm going to tell you the truth from now on about everything. Because if you don't tell the truth now, then later on it hurts even more. So Father rubbed his face with his hands and pulled his chin down with his fingers and stared at the wall. I could see him out of the corner of my eye. And he said, I killed Wellington, Christopher. I wondered if this was a joke, because I don't understand jokes, and when people tell jokes, they don't mean what they say. But then Father said, please, Christopher, just let me explain. Then he sucked in some air and he said, when your mum left, Eileen, Mrs. Shears, she was very good to us, very good to me. She helped me through a very difficult time, and I'm not sure I would have made it without her. Well, you know how she was round here most days, helping out with the cooking and the cleaning, popping over to see if we were okay, if we needed anything. I thought, well, shit, Christopher, I'm trying to keep this simple. I thought she might carry on coming over. I thought maybe I was being stupid. I thought she might eventually want to move in here, or that we might move into her house. We got on really, really well. I thought we were friends, and I guess I thought wrong. I guess, in the end, it comes down to shit. We argued, Christopher, and she said some things I'm not going to say to you because they're not nice, but they hurt. But I think she cared more for that bloody dog than for me. For us. And maybe that's not so stupid, looking back. Maybe we are a bloody handful. And maybe it is easier living on your own looking after some stupid mutt than sharing your life with other actual human beings. I mean, shit, buddy, we're not exactly low maintenance, are we? Anyway, we had this row. Well, quite a few rows, to be honest, but after this particularly nasty little blowout, she chucked me out the house. And you know what that bloody dog was like after the operation? Bloody schizophrenic, nice as pie one moment, roll over, tickle its stomach, sink its teeth into your leg the next. Anyway, we're yelling at each other, and it's in the garden relieving itself. So when she slams the door behind me, the bugger's waiting for me. And I know, maybe if I'd just given it a kick, it would probably have backed off, but shit, Christopher, when that red mist comes down... Christ, you know how it is. I mean, we're not that different, you and me. And all I could think about was that she cared more about this bloody dog than she did about you or me. And it was like everything I'd been bottling up for 2 years just... And then Father was silent for a bit. Then he said, I'm sorry, Christopher. I promise you I never meant for it to turn out like this. And then I knew that it wasn't a joke, and I was really frightened. Father said, we all make mistakes, Christopher. You, me, your mum, everyone. And sometimes they're really big mistakes. We're only human. Then he held up his right hand and spread his fingers out in a fan. But I screamed and pushed him backwards so that he fell off the bed and onto the floor. He sat up and said, okay, look, Christopher, I'm sorry. Let's leave it for tonight, okay? I'm going to go downstairs and you get some sleep and we'll talk in the morning. Then he said, it's going to be all right, honestly. Trust me. Then he stood up and took a deep breath and went out of the room. I sat on the bed for a long time looking at the floor. Then I heard Toby scratching in his cage. I looked up and saw him staring through the bars at me. I had to get out of the house. Father had murdered Wellington. That meant he could murder me because I couldn't trust him, even though he had said trust me, because he had told a lie about a big thing. But I couldn't get out of the house straight away because he'd seen me, so I'd have to wait until he was asleep. The time was 11:16 p.m. I tried doubling twos again, but I couldn't get past 2 to the 15th power, which was 32,768, so I groaned to make the time pass quicker and not think. Then it was 1:20 a.m., but I hadn't heard Father come upstairs to bed. I wondered if he was asleep downstairs or whether he was waiting to come in and kill me. So I got out my Swiss Army knife and opened the saw blade so that I could defend myself. Then I went out of my bedroom really quietly and listened. I couldn't hear anything, so I started going downstairs really quietly and really slowly. And when I got downstairs, I could see Father's foot through the door of the living room. I waited for 4 minutes to see if it moved, but it didn't move. So I carried on walking till I got to the hallway. Then I looked round the door of the living room. Father was lying on the sofa with his eyes closed. I looked at him for a long time. Then he snored, and I jumped, and I could hear the blood in my ears, and my heart going really fast, and a pain like someone had blown up a really big balloon inside my chest. I wondered if I was going to have a heart attack. Father's eyes were still closed. I wondered if he was pretending to be asleep, so I gripped the penknife really hard and I knocked on the doorframe. Father moved his head from one side to the other, and his foot twitched, and he said, but his eyes stayed closed. And then he snored again. He was asleep. That meant I could get out of the house if I was really quiet so I didn't wake him up. I took both my coats and my scarf from the hooks next to the front door, and I put them all on because it would be cold outside at night. Then I went upstairs again really quietly, but it was difficult because my legs were shaking. I went into my room and I picked up Toby's cage. He was making scratching noises, so I took off one of the coats and put it over the cage to make the noise quieter. Then I carried him downstairs again. Father was still asleep. I went into the kitchen and I picked up my special food box. I unlocked the back door and stepped outside. Then I held the handle of the door down as I shut it again so that the click wasn't too loud. Then I walked down to the bottom of the garden. At the bottom of the garden is a shed. It has the lawnmower and the hedge cutter in, and lots of gardening equipment that Mother used to use, like pots, compost, and rainwater. Then I sat down and I felt a bit safer. I decided to leave my other coat over Toby's cage because I didn't want him to get cold and die. I opened up my special food box. Inside was the Milky Bar and 2 licorice laces and 3 clementines and a pink wafer biscuit and my red food colouring. I didn't feel hungry, but I knew that I should eat something because if you don't eat something you can get cold, so I ate 2 clementines and the Milky Bar. Then I wondered what I would do next. Chapter 173. Between the roof of the shed and the big plant that hangs over the fence from the house next door, I could see the constellation Orion. People say that Orion is called Orion because Orion was a hunter, and the constellation looks like a hunter with a club and a bow and arrow. But this is really silly because it's just stars, and you could join up the dots in any way you wanted, and you could make it look like a lady with an umbrella who's waving, or the coffee maker which Mrs. Shears has, which is from Italy, with a handle and steam coming out, or like a dinosaur. And there aren't any lines in space, so you could join bits of Orion to bits of Lepus or Taurus or Gemini and say that they were a constellation called the Bunch of Grapes or Jesus or the Bicycle, except that they didn't have bicycles in Roman and Greek times, which was when they called Orion Orion. And anyway, Orion is not a hunter or a coffee maker or a dinosaur. It's just Betelgeuse and Bellatrix and Anilam and Rigel and 17 other stars I don't know the names of, and their nuclear explosions billions of miles away. And that is the truth. Chapter 179. I stayed awake until 3:47, and that was the last time I looked at my watch before I fell asleep. It has a luminous face and lights up if you press a button, so I could read it in the dark. I was cold, and I was frightened Father might come out and find me, but I felt safer in the garden because I was hidden. I looked at the sky a lot. I like looking up at the sky in the garden at night. In summer, I sometimes come outside at night with my torch and my planisphere, which is 2 circles of plastic with a pin through the middle. And on the bottom is a map of the sky, and on top is an aperture, which is an opening shaped in a parabola, and you turn it round to see a map of the sky that you can see on that day of the year from the latitude 51.5 degrees north, which is the latitude that Swindon is on, because the largest bit of the sky is always on the other side of the earth. And when you look at the sky, you know you're looking at stars which are hundreds and thousands of light years away from you. And some of the stars don't even exist anymore because their light has taken so long to get to us that they're already dead, or they've exploded and collapsed into red dwarfs. And that makes you seem very small. And if you have difficult things in your life, it's nice to think that they're what is called negligible, which means that they're so small you don't have to take them into account when you're calculating something. I didn't sleep very well because of the cold, and because the ground was very bumpy and pointy underneath me, and because Toby was scratching in his cage a lot. But when I woke up properly, it was dawn, and the sky was all orange and blue and purple, and I could hear birds singing, which is called the dawn chorus. And I stayed where I was for another 2 hours and 32 minutes, and then I heard Father come into the garden and call out, "Christopher! Christopher!" So I turned round, and I found an old plastic sack covered in mud that used to have fertilizer in it, and I squeezed myself and Toby's cage and my special food box into the corner between the wall of the shed and the fence and the rainwater tub, and I covered myself with the fertilizer sack. And then I heard Father coming down the garden, and I took my Swiss Army knife out of my pocket and got out the saw blade and held it in case he found us. And I heard him open the door of the shed and look inside. Then I heard him say, "Shit." And then I heard his footsteps in the bushes round the side of the shed, and my heart was beating really fast, and I could feel the feeling like a balloon inside my chest again, and I think he might have looked round the back of the shed, but I couldn't see because I was hiding. But he didn't see me because I heard him walking back up the garden again. Then I stayed still, and I looked at my watch, and I stayed still for 27 minutes. And then I heard Father start the engine of his van. I knew it was his van because I heard it very often, and it was nearby. And I knew it wasn't any of the neighbours' cars because the people who take drugs have a Volkswagen camper van, and Mr. Thompson, who lives at number 40, has a Vauxhall Cavalier, and the people who live at number 34 have a Peugeot, and they all sound different. And when I heard him drive away from the house, I knew it would be safe to come out. And then I had to decide what to do, because I couldn't live in the house with Father anymore because it was dangerous. So I made a decision. I decided that I would go and knock on Mrs. Shear's door, and I would go and live with her, because I knew her and she wasn't a stranger, and I had stayed in her house before when there was a power cut on our side of the street. And this time she wouldn't tell me to go away, because I'd be able to tell her who had killed Wellington, and that way she would know that I was a friend. And also, she would understand why I couldn't live with Father anymore. I took the licorice laces and the pink wafer biscuit and the last clementine out of my special food box and put them in my pocket, and hid the special food box under the fertilizer bag. Then I picked up Toby's cage and my extra coat, and I climbed out from behind the shed. I walked up the garden and down the side of the house. I undid the bolt in the garden door and walked out in front of the house. There was no one in the street, so I crossed and walked up the drive to Mrs. Shear's house and knocked on the door and waited and worked out what I was going to say when she opened the door. But she didn't come to the door, so I knocked again. Then I turned round and saw some people walking down the street, and I was frightened again because it was two of the people who take drugs in the house next door. So I grabbed Toby's cage and went round the side of Mrs. Shear's house and sat down behind the dustbin so they couldn't see me. And then I had to work out what to do. And I did this by thinking of all the things I could do and deciding whether they were the right decision or not. I decided that I couldn't go home again. And I decided that I couldn't go and live with Siobhan because she couldn't look after me when school was closed, because she was a teacher and not a friend or a member of my family. And I decided that I couldn't go and live with Uncle Terry because he lived in Sunderland, and I didn't know how to get to Sunderland, and I didn't like Uncle Terry because he smoked cigarettes and stroked my hair. And I decided I couldn't go and live with Mrs. Alexander because she wasn't a friend or a member of my family, even if she had a dog, because I couldn't stay overnight in the house or use her toilet because she had used it and she was a stranger. And then I thought that I could go and live with Mother because she was my family, and I knew where she lived because I could remember the address from the letters, which was 451C Chapter Road, London, NW2 5NG. Except that she lived in London, and I'd never been to London before. I'd only been to Dover to go to France, and to Sunderland to visit Uncle Terry, and to Manchester to visit Aunt Ruth, who had cancer, except she didn't have cancer when I was there. And I had never been anywhere, apart from the shop at the end of the road, on my own. And the thought of going somewhere on my own was frightening. But then I thought about going home again, or staying where I was, or hiding in the garden every night, and Father finding me, and that made me feel even more frightened. And when I thought about that, I felt like I was going to be sick again, like I did the night before. And then I realized that there was nothing I could do which felt safe. And I made a picture in my head of all the possibilities. 1. Living with Mrs. Shears. 2. Going home. 3. Staying in the garden. 4. Going to live with Uncle Terry. 5. Going to live with Mother. And then I imagined crossing out all the possibilities which were impossible, which is like in a maths exam, when you look at all the questions and you decide which ones you're going to do and which ones you're not going to do, and you cross out all the ones which you're not going to do because then your decision is final and you can't change your mind. Which meant that I had to go to London to live with Mother. And I could do it by going on a train, because I knew all about trains from the train set. How you looked at the timetable and went to the station and bought a ticket and looked at the departure board to see if your train was on time, and then you went to the right platform and got on board. And I would go from Swindon Station, where Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson stop for lunch when they're on their way to Ross from Paddington in the Boscombe Valley mystery.